FMCC Webinar, Supplier Management and Procurement Strategies for Facility Managers, presented by Tim Schmidt. Everyone has been muted for audio quality. If you do have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the chat box, and we'll go over them during the Q&A portion of the webinar. Next slide, please. Thank you. And the next slide, please. Okay, the FMCC provides many services to the FM community, such as Ask the Expert, Find a Consultant, Locate a Speaker, and online educational resources. You may find more information at their website, fmcc.ifma.org. Next slide. Okay, and today I am your moderator, Joshua Amos, the IFMA Components Liaison, and Tim Schmidt is with eBid Systems, and he will be our presenter. Next slide. And at this time, I'd also like to thank our sponsors of the FMCC. And next slide. Okay, at this time, I want to go ahead and turn it over to our presenter, Tim.
Hello and welcome everybody. I'm really excited to be presenting this topic for you, and I hope that everyone gets some information that's helpful to you. So the idea for this session originally came from a session that I had attended at the IFMA Seattle conference a few years ago. And in that session, they had a panel discussion about suppliers and supplier management. Kind of the underlying theme of what was discussed was the importance of relationships and kind of a partner type of relationship with your suppliers. And being that I've got an extensive procurement background, I understood the importance of that. However, the partnership and relationships are just one dimension of the procurement overall process. And so what I wanted to do was to educate folks on the full dimension of strategic sourcing and how that applies to facility management. Now, personally, I've been involved in procurement and technology for a long time. That's my background. And while I consider myself primarily a technology guy, procurement has been the underlying theme of my entire career. I started my career as a procurement manager at a ski resort here in Washington, and from there I started designing and developing procurement software. That was back in the days before things were readily available, and so I wrote a lot of software related to procurement. And since then, I've been involved in the creation and implementation of dozens of procurement applications, and I've participated in hundreds of sourcing events from all different angles, from the supplier to the buyer, consultant, and evaluator. So I have an extensive experience in participating in those sourcing events. Now, I'm going to talk a lot about sourcing, and now sourcing is one element of the procurement process. And while procurement includes everything, sourcing is really focused on the management and identification of suppliers and the process of engaging those suppliers. And so that's what I'm going to be talking about. Now, in my current role at eBid Systems, I provide consulting to our large clients and also the implementation of the software, in which I will consult with those clients on industry best practices and the strategic elements of sourcing. So some of our clients include, we've got clients from all different segments and from all different industries from all over the world. Some of the names that you might recognize would be like NATO, MCOR, Cornell University, probably some of the cities and towns. We also work with the Oman government and government of Tanzania. And the facilities, now for all of these customers and all of these industries, the facilities management is the facilities is a major user for the system. And then we work specifically with facility management companies such as Marin Hunter Codman, MCOR, Westward Management, and others. So I'm going to be using some examples as I go through things as well. So the learning objectives for this session, at the high level, I want you to have a better understanding of what strategic sourcing is. It's an important part of business today, and I want you to have a good understanding of what that is and how it relates to you as facility managers. I want to give you some tactics and some ideas on how this can be implemented for you and how to use those tactics to address and reach your specific sourcing goals. And of course, the ultimate purpose for all of this is to help you to improve the bottom line. So what I'd like to, when I do this session live, of course, I like to ask the audience some questions. And so we're going to have a poll pop up here. And I'd just like to know where procurement fits into your job. Basically, I'd like to know, is procurement your primary responsibility? Are you like a buyer or something like that? Or do you participate in the process in some way? Or maybe procurement isn't part of your job at all and you just want to have some ideas as kind of your own personal enrichment. So we'll give you a second to respond to those polls, or to that poll. And then I believe Joshua is going to pop up the results or something. All right. And
Are you able to see them, Tim?
No.
Okay, we have 14% procurement is my main job responsibility.
Okay.
29% I perform procurement functions. 0% say I oversee procurement activities. 43% says I'm involved but have no procurement. And then 14% is procurement is not part of my job.
Okay, great. Okay, well, that's helpful. Okay, so the next follow-up question is, I'd like to know what kind of organization that you're working for. And I don't really like the way that I worded this question, but I basically want to know, are you working for companies that provide facility management, or are you managing your own facilities, or are you a service provider that might be like janitorial or something that is a service provider to the sourcing industry? So if we can get an idea of that, it would be helpful as well. Give it a minute here. Okay.
Okay, we have 29% managed facilities for company use commercial properties. 29% say other type of service provider, and 43% say none of the above, and the other two options were 0.
Okay, very good. All right. So with that, let me go ahead and jump in and we'll talk about some of these other things. So first of all, what is strategic sourcing? So according to Wikipedia, strategic sourcing is an international institutional procurement process that continually improves and reevaluates purchasing activities of a company. So what does that mean? Basically what it means is that you've got specific processes and methodologies to address procurement, and that you've got processes and methodologies to look at that on an ongoing basis and to improve the processes with the overall goal of lowering costs, improving quality, and reducing risk. Now this process or these methodologies apply to services as well as materials. So typically procurement is associated with materials a lot. It's very well established in the manufacturing industries, but for facility management and other industries, it seems to be lagging behind. And so what I want to do is give you some ideas on how you can better understand the strategic sourcing and take it forward. So there's basically 4 steps to developing a strategic sourcing strategy. So the first one is to analyze spend in your supply resources. You want to categorize suppliers and implement appropriate sourcing strategies and execute that strategy. Now I'm going to go ahead and talk about each of them in more detail. So first of all, in the analyzing spend, the main thing that I think you all know that spend management is a big area of discussion right now. There's lots of softwares dedicated to it, consultants running around specializing in spend management, so it's a big, big topic. Now, for you, for most people, I recommend that they just keep it simple, because you can get totally in depth into this and get lost to where it doesn't really help you to get to the bottom line. So what I recommend is, first of all, get a detailed accounting of all of your spend from your accounting department, and then start grouping that into broad categories. And what you should be looking for are categories that, of course, you spend a lot. That's always what people start with when they're looking at that. But also you want to look at how many suppliers do you have per category, and also what are the pricing variations that you're having for the same products and services. And so in doing that, you're going to find some areas where there's a possibility for improvement in lowering that spend. So you also want to create a list of those target areas that you're going to be focusing on. And of course, we want to focus on those areas that are going to have the greatest impact. Okay, so the next thing that you should do is to categorize your suppliers by the risk impact and the cost impact. So first of all, talking about risk, there's lots of different types of risks that you should be identifying with regards to your suppliers. They could be downtime in your operations. They might be occupational hazards or safety issues that might be introduced by having a supplier that does poor quality. And of course that opens you up to liability and possibly the loss of business. For example, you could have a bad contractor that causes you to lose an important client, or you might have a bad service provider that isn't being responsive to repairing the equipment that you need. So you have to look at the risk impacts from a multi-dimensional basis. And that's the same with cost. Cost does not equal price. There's lots of other related costs, such as if we're talking equipment, it's the total life of that product. If we're talking services, it's the value that you receive. And that's what I want to emphasize, is focus on the value. An example that I like is for a tax consultant. Now, a tax consultant can have fees that vary greatly from one to another. And their fees are relatively mundane, very low. However, they can have a huge cost impact if they're not finding you all the deductions and helping you to maximize or minimize your taxes. All right, so back in 1983, Kraljic is a famous sourcing guy who developed this model, the portfolio purchasing model. And so he published this article in the Harvard Business Review, and the article really focused on that sourcing and procurement should be a strategic element to every business. Prior to that, it was really a clerical type of position rather than a strategic position. And so as part of that paper and as part of his approach, he developed a categorization of your suppliers based upon the different categories in cost and risk. So the first one is your routine suppliers. Now examples of this would be like suppliers of toilet paper, office materials. They're very low cost items that have very little risk associated with them. And often the transaction costs of those can be more than the actual items that are being purchased. So we were talking about from the strategic perspective, you have the high cost and high risk impact. And these are things that are extremely important to your business, and they present high levels of risk. So for example, for Starbucks, coffee beans is a strategic item for them. If the price goes up, that affects their overall profitability, and the price has to go up along with that. Also, if they don't have coffee beans, they're out of business. And so these are items that are critical to the business. Now, I don't know of any specific, I haven't been able to come up with anything related to facility management that falls into this category. And when I've presented this at conferences, I really didn't get any ideas from the audience either as far as what would fall into that category for facilities management. Now, an area that is very important to facilities management are these leverage suppliers. Now, these are items or services that have a big cost impact, so they're expensive and present potentially high costs, but are relatively low in their overall risk. So examples of this might be janitorial services, it might be construction contractors, an HVAC system. Often the things that fall into this category are your capital purchases items. And then finally, you've got the bottleneck suppliers that are low in cost but high in risk. Examples of this would be parts for major equipment, such as your heating and air conditioning. It could be, I had one person that relayed to me how carpet was one of these bottlenecks items. They had, in one of their buildings, they had put in a very unique pattern for a carpet, but didn't realize that they could only get that carpet from one source. And so over time, the supplier was raising the price and have very poor responsiveness to them. And so it really was a bottleneck for them as they needed to replace carpet throughout the building. So the next thing that we want to do is to identify the procurement strategies that are appropriate for each of those different segments. Now I'm going to cover these individually, but the categories or the procurement strategies that Kraljic had identified was the blanket PO, competitive bidding, partnerships, and securing a supply. Now what you should do at this step is you should contrast the current processes or tactics that you're using in each of those segments with those that are recommended or are best practices as presented by Kraljic. And so if we look at the first one here, here we're looking again at those different areas or the different segments. And for your routine suppliers, the blanket PO or the e-procurement solutions are appropriate. So in other words, you want to have a blanket PO in place so that people can buy those relatively low-cost items without having to go through an entire requisition process that or competitive process that really raises the costs from an indirect way. All right, so we were talking about those partnerships before and how everyone, or the kind of the theme of that conference session was that you should approach things from a partnership perspective or a relationship basis. Well, this is really only applicable to the those strategic suppliers, in other words, those that are critical to you. Examples of this would be when you have software provider and they have partners that are implementers, because the implementer can't implement the software that they don't have, and the software company can't sell it if they don't have implementers. So that's an example of a partnership. All right, and then on the bottleneck, you want to secure your supply. And what we're talking about here is that you want to have something in place where you are able to make sure that you get the supplies that you need or the services that you need and guarantee that, but also have a backup plan to make sure that if something happens with that supplier, you have someone else to go to. And then finally, you have competitive bidding and sourcing. Now this is the area that we at eBid Systems are focused on, and this is going to be having your bidding and quote process to make sure that you're reducing that cost impact. All right, so what we want to do now is to execute a strategy for implementing those sourcing strategies. So you want to execute on the sourcing strategy. And so what you need to do that is, first of all, you want to develop the goals for each of those different segments of spend, and you want to develop tactics for each of those goals and how you might achieve those. And then you also want to have a continuous process to evaluate how you're doing in those categories. And kind of underlying all of this stuff is to use technology where it's important, where it's relevant and appropriate, so that you can do these things in an efficient way. So let's talk about some common sourcing goals. So the first one for the routine suppliers. So some common goals in this area are to reduce the number of suppliers and to automate the transaction costs. So because the transaction costs are such an important part of the overall cost, you want to automate that as much as possible to reduce it. From the strategic suppliers, I really recommend marrying the supplier's daughter. So that way you can make sure that they're going to always be there for you. For your leverage suppliers, some of the goals that you might have are to compete the projects over a specific dollar amount, eliminate the suppliers that aren't doing a good job, and then implement a supplier database so that you have a good pool of potential vendors to draw from when it's time to compete those. All right, and then goals for your bottleneck suppliers is you want to identify a new supplier that you can have as a backup and replace that equipment that is proprietary, that puts you in that bottleneck category, and try and move it into other segments where you're not so dependent upon an individual supplier. All right, so the tactics that you might do for this is to centralize your suppliers and potential suppliers into a database so that you have a place that you can draw from to get more competition into your overall process. Also, you should have a multi-dimensional approach to the supplier qualification. A lot of people do this. They evaluate those suppliers on a financial basis, based upon references, whether or not they have the right licenses. And now one of our clients, the Westward Management, they've taken all of this to a different level to give them a strategic advantage over their competitors. They basically have a process whereby they can get suppliers into their database, a public registration process. They qualify those suppliers to make sure that they reach high standards, and then they have a process which to share that information to make sure that the suppliers are being utilized. And they call this their preferred vendor network, and they use that as a selling point to show their clients that things are adequately being competed amongst very, very high quality of suppliers. All right, and then we recommend a competitive sourcing process. So this is your RFPs, RFQs, RFIs. And so what you should do from an RFP perspective is to have a multi-dimensional approach to the decision process. Make the decision based upon performance criteria rather than just price. And in that process, you should focus on what you need rather than how it should be done, because often vendors can have unique ways of doing things that get the job done faster and less expensively than if you specifically lay out what they should do. And then you should score those responses based upon those multi-dimensions to get an overall view of who is the right supplier for what you're doing. Now, in the request for quote process, this is typically where you get the quotes from the different vendors, and you say, okay, give me a price for bricks, or give me a price for carpet, and you make it on a more commodity type basis. So this is appropriate for your commodity items. Now on this one, you actually want to focus on what it is that you want so that you're comparing apples to apples and oranges to oranges, not to use a cliche, which I did anyways. And in this, you're really looking at the cost. And so once again, look at the cost from not just the price, but the overall cost of ownership. It might include like delivery, warranties, etc. And then, as we had mentioned, use a pre-qualification process so that the vendors that you're allowing to compete for this are of a very high quality and not just some guy working out of his truck. All right, so some guidelines for using or implementing the competition I've kind of outlined here. The main thing that I want to emphasize is that the competition should be fair. You want to have a process that genuinely lets you find the right supplier. And so where I've seen it as an example where there's not a fair process, the vendors can tell that. You know, they're going to ask you questions to figure out, okay, is this a fair process to give you a quote for that remodel, or have you already made up your mind and you're just going through the process to get some numbers to compare? And so obviously if they get that impression, they're not going to put a lot of effort into it. And so some of the guidelines for making sure that it's fair is that the specifications is generic, that everyone can apply and not just those from a specific supplier, and to make those criteria objective, and then share that criteria with the vendors so that they know how they're going to be rated. Also on the Q&A, this is really important. So rather than spending your time on the phone talking with all the different suppliers where there might be different answers and different information that comes up that gives one vendor an advantage, get the questions in writing and respond in writing and share that with all of the vendors. And then finally, when it comes to negotiation, first of all, don't share the information with the other vendors until after you've made a choice. So for example, you get vendor that calls and say, well, how did I do on pricing? You say, well, you were a little bit high here. They say, well, I can reduce my price. And next thing you know, you've entered into negotiation with that vendor, which isn't fair because the other vendor that was lower may also lower their costs. So when you do the negotiation, you should start with the overall best. You want to include the overall best scoring vendors and maybe just negotiate with the top 2 or 3 and get a best and final offer, for example. All right, so another tactic that you can use is to implement the supplier assessment. And we talked about this already in terms of you want to evaluate the suppliers based upon multiple dimensions. But what I want to emphasize here is that you need to have a process to do that continuously. How many times have you seen a vendor that checked out well, they had all the right licenses, and they seemed to financially be doing well. Well, then a couple years down the road, they've got some turnover, the staff isn't very good, they're in a precarious position, and next thing you know, that vendor is no longer able to provide you the services that you need without a large amount of risk. And so what you need to do is have a process to evaluate them. And so what we recommend is that you score those vendors on what's called key performance indicators, or areas that you've identified which are really important for that segment of supplier. Also create a place for institutional knowledge of suppliers. We had one company that I talked to that had lost a major contract because a supplier that they had was providing or a contractor was providing poor service to their clients. Well, as it turned out, the supplier had been in trouble and not done a good job at a number of sites, but because there was no way that they could share that information, the property manager that had hired this contractor did not know of these previous problems, and from all he knew, they'd done a lot of work with the company, and so they were good, but it turned out that they really weren't. So one of the ways to do this is to use technology for doing those supplier assessments. Now, one of our clients uses the system to get the evaluation from those suppliers from their references, and they have a specific methodology for getting responses from the supplier or from the references, and then scoring that in an objective way. And then our system also has the ability to send out these surveys to different stakeholders in the organization so that you can score them on an ongoing basis. And then, as you can see here in this example, this particular vendor is a tier 2 vendor, meaning they're not top-notch, but they are also quite good. So we recommend that type of approach. And as I mentioned, you want to use the appropriate software. Now, one of the things that I hear from people is that they don't adequately compete things because it's too arduous and difficult to do. Well, when you're doing everything manually, that certainly is the case. Also, to try and get feedback and score things, if you're doing that manually, it's very difficult, and it's hard to see the value on that when you're fighting fires on a day-to-day basis. So if you use technology, it can help to automate a lot of those processes. And we're going to take a look at some of those. So first of all, in the supplier management, you should have a central vendor database of information. Now, for a lot of organizations, that's a spreadsheet. That's fine if the pool of vendors is small and if that really is being updated and available to people, but a web-based vendor management database is going to be a lot more effective, and it can include those key performance indicators. On the sourcing, you want to have tools that automate the sourcing process and ensure competition. We provide you reporting and feedback to make sure that people are adequately using the processes that you've identified and implementing the appropriate level of competition. And then finally, on the e-procurement, you want to have things that automate the procurement process for those smaller dollar items. All right, so taking a look specifically at the supplier management. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time giving the sales pitch on the software, but I just want to emphasize some of the key functionality that is important when you're looking at the software for managing the different aspects. So on the supplier management software, it's important to have a web portal where the information is maintained and updated by the vendors. If you've got to do everything manually and through email, it is too time-consuming and it doesn't get done. What you want to do is send out an invitation to them or a notice to them that they have to go in and update their profile with, for example, current revenues, licenses, etc. You want to have the custom fields so that you can track the information that's relevant to you, and then also have a process where the vendors are qualified and approved. There needs to be a central place where people can track notes and other information about the supplier so that Joe can report that, gosh, these guys really screwed up on this project, for example. And then finally, to have some methodology to track performance and to regularly gather feedback about those. Okay, and then on the sourcing side, this is what, that RFX management. Now, I find that a lot of facility managers don't really use the RFP or RFQ process to make sure that they have competition for the things that are important. And the reason why they tell me is that it's just too hard. And when you're doing it manually, as I mentioned, it is hard. So what you want to do is implement a tool that has all the right functionality that you need to streamline that process. Our clients typically tell us that the amount of time it takes to manage that process using our software is about 70% less than it is for a manual process. And the key things that help drive that is having templates for those RFP documents and RFQ documents, so they have standard templates and information to start from. They have automated notifications, so they're not having to put together lists of vendors and sending them out emails individually and calling. And so they have that central database so that they can automatically send out those notifications. The Q&A management is done online, so they're not on the phone and trying to consolidate information from emails. And there's also online bid submission and tabulation. And what you're looking at here on the screen is an example of where the bids were submitted online, and then at a touch of a button, we can compare the pricing of the individual items. And you can see in this example, the ABC supplier was way outside of the pricing information, and looking at this, they were probably putting in an annual price rather than a monthly price, for example. But you can see that tabulated. And then from the e-procurement side of things, there's companies that can help you manage the catalogs. Vinimaya is a great example. They do a fantastic job of taking all of those items and putting them into a Amazon type catalog. And so you can do a search for a part and it will give you the lowest price from all of the suppliers that provide that part. And so the suppliers feed in the information on an ongoing basis, and they can shop for those items, place the orders, issue the PO, all from an automated basis. So it certainly is better than reaching out to all the different suppliers and getting a price on the part and comparing those quotes. And that's the way that we used to have to do it back when I was when I started being a procurement officer. All right, so that's that's the presentation, giving you, presenting those ideas. We talked about what the strategic sourcing is and how to apply that to facilities, and we've talked about specific tactics that you can use to put these principles into practice. And I think that you can see by doing so that you're going to help the bottom line and the overall lowering of costs and improving profitability. So with that, I'm going to ask if there are any questions that you would like for me to address. Are there any questions? Joshua, and go ahead.
Yeah, anybody, if you have any questions, please type them into the chat box, and I'll be happy to present them to Tim. We'll give you all just a minute or two to see if you have any questions. And then, of course, Tim's contact information is there at the bottom of the PowerPoint. And I'm sure if you come up with any questions later on, feel free to reach out to Tim. I'm sure he'd be happy to assist you.
Yeah, and the slide deck will be posted on the website as well. Did you want to give them some details on that, Joshua?
Sure. Yeah, and a little bit, the recording and a copy of the PowerPoint will be on the FMCC website, fmcc.ifma.org. So you can certainly access it there as well.
Mm-hmm.
So
you can just download it and watch it on your Friday evenings when you're looking for some amazing entertainment. Share it with the wife and kids.
That's right.
All right.
Okay.
Do we have any questions yet?
Not at this time. We'll go ahead and go to the next slide.
All right.
Okay, we do want to let everyone know that we do have upcoming webinars that the FMCC will be hosting. There's a quick list overview taking us through October. So I do hope you join us for those. And go ahead into the next slide. And the FMCC does want to let everyone know and let them be aware that other councils are out there as resources as well. And we'd just like to make you aware of those opportunities. And the next slide. There we go. Tim, I want to thank you very much for a great presentation today.
Yeah, and I want to thank you for the opportunity and thank everyone for attending. And I hope that you got some good, useful information out of it.
Yeah, it was excellent. Thank you very much. And everyone, thank you for attending. I'll give you a few minutes back to your day. Everyone, take care.